É com grande satisfação que vamos dar início à abertura do 6º Simpósio Internacional sobre a Justiça. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's our pleasure to initiate the words for the 6th International Symposium on Justice. Antes de mais nada, vamos passar a palavra ao ilustríssimo professor Dr. Drayton Gonzaga de Souza, diretor da Faculdade de Filosofia e Ciências Humanas, e ao ilustríssimo senhor Procurador-Geral do Estado, Dr. Carlos Henrique Kuyper, representando o governador Tasso Genro.
Ilustríssimo Dr. Carlos Henrique Kuyper, Procurador-Geral do Estado, representando neste ato o governador do Estado do Rio Grande do Sul, Tasso Genro, caríssimo colega, professor Dr. Nythamar Oliveira. Gostaria de saudar todos os presentes, nossos alunos, professores, visitantes de fora, especialmente os nossos ilustres convidados de outros países. É uma grande alegria que participe da cerimônia de abertura deste 6º Simpósio Internacional da Justiça e gostaria de expressar o meu sincero agradecimento ao professor Dr. Nythamar Oliveira, que se empenhou muitíssimo na organização desse evento, justamente com uma equipe com professores dos Ciências Criminais, Ciências Sociais, e o evento também tem o apoio do pós-graduação em Direito da PUC, o apoio do Programa de Pós-graduação em Filosofia da PUC, coordenado pelo professor Dr. Givino Valesca, que se encontra. Tem a colaboração inestimável de outras universidades, como a Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, a Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina e o grupo de trabalho da Prof, Teoria da Justiça. A todos que colaboraram de alguma forma para que esse evento se tornasse realidade, muito obrigado. O apoio também da CAPES, com um valor significativo que viabilizou esse evento. Como referi, não é a primeira vez que acontece esse evento, já há alguns anos, e penso que não seria exagerado dizer que nós devemos muito ao nosso colega, professor Dr. Nythamar Oliveira, que perseverantemente se empenha tanto na organização desse simpósio. Esse simpósio não começou aqui, começou em Florianópolis, né? O primeiro foi lá, e depois veio aqui para a PUC de Porto Alegre. Nythamar, muito obrigado pelo empenho. Pessoas que organizam eventos sabem o que significa isso. Eu participei de alguma edição desse evento com o Nythamar na organização, mas foram edições anteriores, mas sempre ele fez muito mais que eu. Então, quem participa de organização de eventos sabe a preocupação que é um evento, já o envio de formulários para as agências de fomento que têm sido muito generosas conosco, por sinal, parte delas, pelo menos. Depois a prestação de contas. Só quem já preencheu esses formulários sabe o que significa organizar um evento. Mas nós sempre, Nythamar e eu, sempre dizemos que, apesar da burocracia, nós temos a satisfação de ter apoio das agências de fomento, pelo menos de algumas delas, né? Isso não é uma coisa tão evidente em outros países desse mundo afora. Então, muito obrigado pela presença de todos, reitero, especialmente dos nossos convidados aqui da Alemanha. Nós temos uma boa delegação da Alemanha, onde fala alemã. E ich möchte mich herzlich bedanken für den Besuch von so wichtigen Gästen aus Deutschland und aus anderen Ländern. Ich hoffe, dass Sie sich hier wohlfühlen während dieser Tage, dass es fruchtbare Tage, Diskussionstage werden. Muito obrigado a todos e muito obrigado, reitero, ao governo do Estado, representado aqui pelo Dr. Carlos Henrique Kuyper.
Bom, boa noite a todas e a todos. Serei brevíssimo, eu já vi que a nominata aqui dos que, né, estão previstos para falar, realmente me impõe aqui que não perca muito tempo de todas e de todos. Eu gostaria de destacar que o governador recebe assim, uma série de convites, ele evidentemente não consegue comparecer e muitos deles ele nem consegue mandar representante, mas ele fez questão, né, de pedir para eu dar uma saudação aqui a todos e a todas. Na verdade, o governador, além de político, ele é um pensador, né, arriscaria dizer até um filósofo, e então quando ele recebeu o convite ele ficou muito sensibilizado com o tema e pediu para que eu viesse aqui dar um abraço, dar um muito bem-vindo aí, principalmente, né, dos que estão visitando o Rio Grande do Sul. E então eu venho trazer aí essa mensagem de que os trabalhos sejam, né, bem frutíferos. Os temas aqui realmente são, né, super interessantes, super atuais. E eu queria aproveitar a oportunidade de dizer que para mim pessoalmente também é um prazer estar de novo aqui na PUC. Eu me formei na Faculdade de Direito, né, e que tem tudo a ver também com esses temas aqui. Então é sempre uma satisfação muito grande retornar aqui de onde eu dediquei 5 anos da minha vida que foram muito intensos. Eu militei no movimento estudantil. Uma satisfação muito grande estar aqui representando o governador e dar essa saudação para todos e a todas. Muito obrigado.
Bom, sem mais demora, os senhores podem retornar aos seus lugares. And I would like to invite to compose the table Professor Dr. Klaus-Gerd Giesen, Professor Dr. Marcelo de Araujo. First of all, I'd like to say just very few words to thank again the organizing and scientific committees. All the data, all papers, and abstracts for the lectures are available on the website that has been announced here. And I'd like to say a special word of gratefulness to Alessandro Pinzani, Alfredo Stork, Emil Sobotica, Giovanni Saavedra, Denilson Verli, and Paulo Konzen, who composed the organizing committee. Professors Agemi Bavaresco, Daniel Tourinho Pérez, Delamar Volpato Dutra, Isabel Limonde, Luiz Bernardo de Araújo, Marcos Nobre, and Vladimir Barreto Lisboa. It has been real teamwork to put up this event together, and we are very grateful that everyone could contribute to making this 6th edition of the International Symposium on Justice to take place now, this week. First of all, let me introduce Professor Klaus-Gerd Giesen, who has been with us in the very first edition of the International Symposium on Justice in 1997 in Florianopolis. Professor Giesen is Professor of Political Science at the Université d'Auvergne in Clermont-Ferrand, France. He got his doctoral degree from the University of Geneva and has been assistant and instructor at the University of Geneva and at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. He has also taught at the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium, as well as professor at the University of Leipzig in Germany, where he was for some time director of the Institute of Political Science. In addition, he taught as visiting professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, at the Université de Champagne-Ardenne in France, at the Institut d'études politiques in Aix-en-Provence, as well as at the Free University in Brussels, Belgium. He was visiting researcher at the Philosophy Department of the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and at the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences of the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. He also taught for 3 years at the University of Lyon and is now a visiting professor at the University of Lausanne. Among other prizes, we can mention Prix Lemonot of the Institut de France and Prix Chaplet of the Société Académique de Genève. I'd like to introduce Professor Dr. Marcelo de Araujo, who has been with us on several editions of the symposium, as well in our research group in theories of justice. Professor Marcelo de Araujo studied philosophy and law at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, with a master's in philosophy by the same university and a PhD in philosophy at the Université Konstanz in Germany. He's now professor of ethics at the State University of Rio, UERJ, and associate professor in philosophy of law at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He has been working in the areas of political philosophy, philosophy of law, and ethics. You did the right magic word.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to be here and would like to thank Nythamar and the organizing committee for the kind invitation. I apologize for not being able to speak to you in Portuguese. Actually, my English is not much better. Nythamar mentioned the first symposium on justice 15 years ago in Florianopolis. I participated in that conference. It was my first conference in Brazilian philosophy, and at that time my lecture was about justice in international relations. It was on Rawls' theory of international relations. And today it is again about justice in international relations, just to make sure that there is some sort of continuity between the two events. Over the last 15 years, since that first symposium on justice, the world has obviously changed considerably. Among other things, new technology has quickly transformed our reality, our everyday life, our communications, and also the way we wage war. Smartphones, war drones, genetic therapy and cloning, the neurosciences, and above all the spectacular rise of the internet, including the web and FTP protocols, to mention but a few, challenge our traditional views about what justice actually is about and how to apply it to society. Even more, the sudden appearance of new technologies has caused deep crisis among the populations. Moral crisis, for instance, in bioethics, or as far as the use of drones in military operations are concerned, and crisis of intelligibility. The new technologies explode our traditional categories of thinking. The way to conceptualize and to define the human being, communication between the humans, the relationship between the humans and the machine, as well as with the rest of the planet Earth, the dichotomy of war and peace as well. Philosophy is precisely the main academic field in which new conceptualizations may take place. For sure, we have to continue to study the classical dead white man for the sake of understanding them, Plato, Spinoza, Hegel, Levinas, Rawls, etc. However, it seems also highly interesting and actually more challenging to try to carefully use their writings in order to better understand our new technology-induced problems, to make sense of our new realities. And that's exactly what I will try to do tonight. As far as justice-related issues are concerned, we can adopt two fundamental stances about dangerous new technologies. Either a fatalistic one or a responsible one. The fatalistic one has been proposed, among others, by Martin Heidegger in his letter on humanism to Jean Beaufret, published in 1949, Heidegger wrote this obscure sentence, I quote, "Technology is by its nature a destiny within the history of being, the truth of being as it rests in the oblivion," unquote. 5 years later, in Die Frage nach der Technik, the question of technology, he makes it more explicit. I quote, "The essence of modern technology is revealed in what we call the Gestell frame." The Gestell, unquote. The Gestell, which is actually much wider concept than simple technology, leads us to, I quote, "the extreme edge of the abyss," unquote. He declares, I quote, "The threat to the human being does not come first from machines and technical equipment. The real threat has already reached the human being in its essence. The domination of the Gestell threats us by its ability to deny human access to a more original revelation and hence to a more original truth. And therefore, where there is Gestell, there is danger in its strongest meaning. However, where there is danger also rises what can save us. Let us carefully take into consideration the words of Hölderlin. Thus, it has to be the true essence of technology which contains in itself the rise of what will save," unquote. According to Heidegger, the rescue from the technological catastrophe can only be performed by non-philosophical thought, Denken, which gradually may discover the truth of being, as when the danger of technology is increasing. The bigger is the danger to mankind and the closer it comes to the abyss, the greater are also its chances of being rescued by the revelation of the truth of being. Hence, we can see a sort of automatism in Heidegger's approach. Technology, under the domination of the Gestell, being more and more dangerous, will almost automatically, depending on the degree of danger, bring us closer to the truth of being, and therefore dictate our conduct in relation to it, provided that one pays attention to it, particularly through art and poetry. In other words, the development of modern technology is a real challenge to us by the Gestell, the frame, a challenge which we can notice only if we pay full attention to the gradual arrival of the truth of being, beyond any ontology and any ethics. The technology will remain out of human control as long as mankind does not have access to the being, and thus to the Gestell which frames technology. The progressive loss of control of technology is therefore programmed. For the time being, it remains beyond the human will. We cannot reach and therefore slow down or regulate the development of technology and its dangers until the mysterious truth of being is revealed to us and thus explained to us what is actually the Gestell. Martin Heidegger's approach is politically and ethically speaking demobilizing and leading to apathy, since philosophy, the social sciences, and even politics can't contribute to tame technology. Only the arts and poetry can, once we are getting close enough to the abyss. This is sheer fatalism. Heidegger's former student Hans Jonas has opposed this stance in his book of 1979, Das Prinzip Verantwortung, the imperative of responsibility, which carries the subtitle An Ethic for the Technological Civilization. Jonas pleads for an active ethics of technology, limiting its possibly negative consequences. Instead of just fatalistically waiting and doing nothing until something saves us from Prometheus Unchained, Jonas adopts a Kantian-inspired categorical imperative which goes as follows. I quote Jonas: "Act in a way that the effects of your action are compatible with the permanence of genuine human life on Earth," unquote. It's a future-oriented, normative theory of technology as far as justice for future generations is concerned. In my lecture today, I adopt the second stance of Hans Jonas. To let it just go before something saves us may ultimately lead either to the potential collapse of the biosphere, for instance through nuclear war or genetics applied to humans, animals and plants, or at least to immense human suffering, even if there were an ultimate heroic creature or event which saved us from total disaster. In addition, intuitively, I just lack the faith in the very possibility of such an event. Thus, let us better attempt to regulate the use of technology before it's too late. In each case, the main question is, how far can we go? How can we use new technologies to improve our life conditions, elevate poverty, raise comfort, reduce stress, etc.? And what should be absolutely prohibited? Nuclear war, human reproductive cloning, state surveillance of private space. If technically speaking anything goes, there should still be moral limits. Limits imposed by theories of justice and possibly enshrined in legal norms. Tonight I'd like to explore justice in a technological realm which emerged very recently, cyberwar. And I would like to apply the theory of justice of one dead white man, Immanuel Kant, in order to modestly give some hints about how to regulate the rapidly developing cyber warfare. Since Heraclitus, there is a philosophy of war. That's because the dichotomy of war and peace structures our lives. Almost all major philosophers have outlined the philosophy of war and peace, including the most recent, Levinas, Rawls, Derrida, Habermas. Generally, it's an attempt to grasp the very nature of war and/or peace, as well as to define justice in relation to this domain. I would like to argue that cyberwar is changing our understanding of what war and peace actually is, and how to conceptualize the relationship between the human being and the machine. At the same time, it introduces a totally new military dimension for which we, philosophers and political scientists, have the duty to establish an ethical framework, as it otherwise remains a state of nature in which the strongest actor rules without limitation, which is nowadays, just at the present, United States of America. Cyber warfare is a new warfare domain. National and international norms have yet to be established. Globalization and the internet have given individuals, organizations, and nations incredible new power based on constantly developing networking technology. For everyone, ordinary citizen, scholars, soldiers, spies, propagandists, hackers, and terrorists, information gathering, communications, fundraising, and public relations have been digitized and revolutionized. We are now in the beginning only of the information revolution. The computer is the new steam engine, so to speak. It dramatically facilitates the acquisition and validation of knowledge and information through the rise of the cyberspace. Nowadays, more than 1 billion computers are directly connected to the internet, and there are more than 1.5 billion internet users on Earth. As a consequence, all political and military conflicts now have a cyber dimension, the size and impact of which are still difficult to grasp. And the battles fought in cyberspace can in the future be more important than events taking place on the ground. In cyber conflict, the terrestrial distance between the adversaries is almost irrelevant, because everyone is a next-door neighbor in cyberspace. With optical fiber and satellite transmissions, computer signals travel almost at the speed of light. The most powerful weapons are not based on physical strength, but on logic and innovation. Cyber warfare is definitely unlike traditional warfare, but it shares some characteristics with the historical role of aerial bombardment, submarine warfare, and special operation force. Specifically, it can inflict painful, asymmetric damage on an adversary from a distance or by exploiting the element of surprise. And cyber war is comparatively very, very cheap. The interconnectivity of the internet poses an enormous threat to civilian infrastructure. Indeed, most military networks rely on civilian, mainly commercial computer infrastructure, such as undersea, fiber optic cables, satellites, routers, or nodes. Conversely, civilian vehicles, shipping, and air traffic controls are increasingly equipped with navigation systems relying on GPS satellites, which are also used by the military. Thus, it is to a large extent impossible to differentiate between purely civilian and purely military computer infrastructure. This poses a serious challenge to the principle of distinction between military and civilian objects. I will come back to that later. Interconnectivity means that the effects of an attack on a military target may not be confined to this target. Indeed, a cyber attack may have repercussions on various other systems, including civilian systems and networks, for instance by spreading malware, malicious software, such as viruses or worms, if these are uncontrollable. Therefore, because of its increasingly ubiquitous reliance on computer systems, civilian infrastructure is highly vulnerable to computer network attacks. In particular, a number of critical installations, such as power plants, nuclear plants, dams, water treatment and distribution systems, oil refineries, gas and oil pipelines, banking systems, including cash machines, stock exchanges, and all the rest of the financial world, hospital systems, railroads, and air traffic control rely on information technology. These systems, which constitute the link between the digital and the physical world, are extremely vulnerable to outside interference by almost any attacker. That is what is labeled the Internet of Things. That is, all objects connected to the Internet. In May 2009, US President Obama made a dramatic statement. I quote, "Cyber intruders have probed our electrical grid. In other countries, cyber attacks have plunged entire cities into darkness," unquote. Investigative journalists subsequently concluded that these attacks took place in Brazil, affecting millions of civilians in the state of Espírito Santo in 2005 and in Rio de Janeiro in 2007, and that the source of the attacks is still unknown. Richard Clarke, the former special advisor to President George W. Bush on cybersecurity, said later, I quote him, "Given the degree of seriousness that the Obama administration is applying to cybersecurity and the smart grid, we can look forward to the kind of things happening here that happened to Brazil, where hackers successfully brought down the power," unquote. The claim has been dismissed by the Brazilian government, but I must say I rather trust, in this case, Richard Clarke. Whatever the truth may be, Brazil is still today one of the most cyber-attacked nations in the world. And recently, for instance, the governor of Bahia has been attacked, the government website of Bahia has been attacked. National security planners should consider that electricity, for instance, has no substitute, and all other infrastructures, including computer networks, depend on it. The manipulation of electrical grid management systems is probably, for the time being, the greatest threat at present. In addition, distribution networks for food, water, money, goods, and energy rely on information technology at every stage, as do transportation, healthcare, and financial services. Potentially catastrophic scenarios, such as collisions between aircrafts, the release of radiation from nuclear plants, the release of toxic chemicals from chemical plants, or the disruption of vital infrastructure and services such as electricity or water networks cannot be discarded. In 2010, the Stuxnet computer worm, likely an American-Israeli joint venture, accomplished what 5 years of United Nations Security Council resolutions could not, to disrupt Iran's pursuit of a nuclear bomb. 0.5 megabyte, nothing, of computer code quietly substitute for airstrikes by the Israeli Air Force. Moreover, Stuxnet may have been more effective than a conventional military attack and may have avoided a major international crisis over human collateral damage. To some degree, the vulnerability, even without any direction, the connection to the internet, because Stuxnet has been distributed by USB sticks. No nuclear installation is connected to the internet, but the Stuxnet computer has been spread through USB sticks. So the vulnerability to such spectacular attacks will provide a strong temptation for nation-states to take advantage of computer hacking's perceived high return on investment. Military forces are, of course, no exception. Now it gets worse. Information technology is used to manage military forces. For example, especially for command and control and for logistics. Already today, it is technically feasible that a foreign state takes fully or partly control of its enemies' information technology infrastructure and manipulates it in order to fire weapons such as missiles or even nuclear missiles at its own cities and own population. So you don't need to have nuclear weapons anymore if you have enough information technology power to manipulate the management of the nuclear weapons of your enemy. All things considered, the current balance of cyberpower favors the attacker. This stands in contrast to our historical understanding of warfare, in which the defender has traditionally enjoyed a home field advantage. Therefore, many governments may conclude that for the foreseeable future, the best cyber defense is a good offense. Today, cyber attacks can target political leadership, military systems, and average citizen anywhere in the world during peacetime or war, in many cases with the added benefit of attacker anonymity. In addition, the rapid proliferation of internet technologies, including hacker tools and tactics, makes it impossible for any organization, including national armies, to be familiar with all of them. Frequent software updates and network reconfiguration change the internet geography unpredictably and without warning. Cyber attacks are more flexible than any other weapon system the world has ever seen. They can be used for propaganda, espionage, and the destruction of critical infrastructure, as well as of large populations, the destruction of large populations. For the time being, there are few moral inhibitions to cyber warfare because it relates primarily to the use and exploitation of information in the form of computer code and data packets. So far, there is little perceived human suffering, but that may change very, very soon. From the ethical viewpoint, it is important to differentiate between an act of cyber war and an act which may be wrong but does not fall under the category of war. Unlike many other authors, Einsinger, Michalski, etc., it seems to me appropriate to plead for a rather restrictive definition in order not to overload the concept of cyber war. One of the problems lies in the fact that intrusions on the national territory are not done by soldiers or objects, tanks, aircrafts, etc. In this respect, some misconceptions should be put into perspective. Cyber war as such, in my view, can only take place directly between two or more states. However, strict state affiliation should not be the sole criterion for combatant status. That is, the otherwise restrictive definition should also include non-state actors which are subordinated to the will of a state, as for instance non-governmental groups of so-called patriotic hackers in Russia, China, Israel, and elsewhere. Patriotic hackers which work closely together with the national armies and which are actually controlled by the national armies. And such definition also excludes, of course, non-state territorial units such as the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, Palestine, or Transnistria. Unlike Maristella states, it seems to me that the principle of territoriality as an essential attribute of state sovereignty should be an integral part of the definition, despite the fact that due to the decentralized nature of the internet, or more or less decentralized, I will get back to that, any malware can actually cross many borders within a fraction of a second before finding its target. What matters here are, in my view, the effects of any cyber attack on a national territory. The principle of armed aggression required to justify any entry into war, that is Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, should be maintained, in my view, except that the meaning of what can legitimately be considered as a weapon must evolve. A targeted, powerful, and destructive computer worm can perfectly match the definition of a weapon. Here again, it all depends on the effect. After all, a plane can also be used to transport food or to bomb cities. Cyber war requires information technologies to be used for destructive purposes. The specialized literature celebrates the resurgence of asymmetric warfare in cyberspace. Facing a state with a powerful cyber army, such as the United States of America, Israel, China, or Russia, these are the four cyber powers, right? United States, Israel, China, and Russia. All other countries may have, to different degrees, some offensive or defensive cyber capacities and may be tempted to harass them. However, the balance of power leaves for the moment no doubt about the outcome of such an asymmetric conflict. It must nevertheless be admitted that neither total victory nor total defeat are likely in cyberspace alone. One of the peculiarities of cyber warfare is the possibility of a so-called sub-rosa conflict. In this case, what is a sub-rosa conflict? In this case, neither the attacker nor even the defender wishes to make public, including in the eyes of its own people, the existence of a cyber clash. Either in order not to lose face in the event of defeat for the attacked state, or out of fear of the international public opinion for the aggressor state, or for both, to avoid an escalating conflict by a spillover effect on other military spheres, conventional or nuclear warfare, or to avoid the panic of populations. The sub-rosa conflict poses the dilemma of democratic legitimacy of any major military decision versus technocratic efficiency by experts. It is clear that from the standpoint of international justice, the greatest possible transparency must be required. Thereby, waging a sub-rosa cyber war should at least be discussed and authorized behind closed doors by relevant parliamentary defense committees. Following these prerequisites, one can quickly dismiss cybercrime, which is not cyber war, even by non-state groups such as the Russian mafia. The Russian mafia has considerable cyber capacities. Cyber propaganda and hacktivism, so-called hacktivism, even if they may include DDoS, so-called DDoS attacks against government websites, such as the attack against the government of Bahia. A one-time cyber sabotage by a state, the Stuxnet virus, which I mentioned just a few moments ago, thus significantly remains below the threshold which reasonably, in my view, defines cyber war, cyber sabotage. Cyber espionage, you may have heard of the NSA, the American National Security Agency, also in Brazil. As a matter of fact, the espionage through new technologies is as old as relations between states. The hacking of government computers or implants such as the flame worm, the so-called or the theft of data do not make any exception, but that's not cyber war in my view. And cyber terrorism and cyber guerrilla, neither they are the result of non-state groups against one or several states, and fall therefore not within the category of interstate conflict. There has been, for instance, on October 21, 2002, an attack against the so-called internet domain root service. Now, you have to understand that most of you probably know that the whole internet is very centralized, actually, because if you use your browser, www, you end up somewhere, and so there has to be one single register of all these addresses, one single register in the world. There cannot be two, it has to be one. So this register is somewhere, it's on a computer near Washington. And then it's updated updated constantly and copied in real time to 10 other services, one in Stockholm, one in London, one in Tokyo, etc., etc. So actually the whole infrastructure of the internet relies on 11 computers. So there has been an attack against these special so-called root servers on October 21, 2002, and it brought down 6 of these 11 root servers. So it is believed it was Al-Qaeda, because it's 2002, and you know what happened in 2001, the invasion of Afghanistan, etc., but we are not sure. So actually, this is a high risk that all the 11 root servers are down and then the internet is gone. Right? Okay, so this is cyber terrorism, and I don't believe it cannot be labeled as cyber war because it's done by non-state actors, because no state in the world has any interest to bring down the 11 root servers. No state in the world has any interest in it. Thus, the dividing lines between different malicious activities are taking place on the internet are actually not so good. I think we can make a clear definition for that. Now, towards the Kantian theory of just cyberwar. We now can turn to the question of the proper basis for an ethical approach which could deal with the issue of cyberwar. My preference goes to the just war theory, which historically stems from natural law, precisely because it's an old theory. It started with Cicero, it goes to Michael Walzer, teaching at Princeton, etc. And gradually, over the centuries, the just war theory was able to adapt to all technological revolutions in warfare. For instance, Vittoria introduced in the 16th century the important distinction between combatants and civilians, with a concomitant notion of collateral damage as a result of the emergence of artillery technology on the battlefields. Or in the 1940s and 1950s, John Ford, Paul Ramsey, and James Turner Johnson, among others, discussed the highly relevant question if a defensive nuclear war can be a just war. A defensive nuclear war can be a just war. So just war theory is rather flexible, almost a casuistry, and adaptable to new technologies of warfare. However, the classical just war theory will be amended here in this lecture by reference to Immanuel Kant, in the sense that it seems logical to add to the traditional jus ad bellum and jus in bello a Kantian jus post bellum. That is, as I've tried to demonstrate in some publication, Immanuel Kant was himself not only a philosopher of peace, reputed for his seminal writing on perpetual peace, but also a philosopher of war, who in the metaphysics of morals developed a theory of just war, except that this ultimate philosophical foundation is provided by the subject and not by a metaphysical natural order as in natural law. As already in perpetual peace, but contrary to what he had noticed a few years earlier in his Idee zu einer Geschichte in allgemeiner weltbürgerlicher Absicht, Kant states in the doctrine of law that ultimately, I quote, perpetual peace is obviously an impossible idea, unquote. Especially because, that's paragraph 61 of the doctrine of law, especially because the gradual extension of the so-called Foedus Pacificum, the Republican Foedus Pacificum, to the entire surface of the earth would lead to a world government failing to control the situation and thus to many civil wars. The problem of the moral status of war remains therefore unsolved, since it concerns the conflicting relations of states that are historically still outside the Republican Foedus Pacificum and of the Republican states with one or more non-Republican states. Paragraphs 56 to 60 of the Doctrine of Law are devoted to define the criteria for determining the justice or injustice of any empirically given war. From the outset, Kant distinguishes the doctrine of just war from its predecessors, from his predecessors. Firstly, by the structure of his argument. To the traditional jus ad bellum, that's paragraph 56 and 57, and jus in bello, paragraph 57, he adds a surprising, it's the first one, surprising jus post bellum, paragraph 58 and 60, and also by the content of the criteria developed. Here Kant goes back to the criteria used by Aquinas. Indeed, the 4 Thomistic jus ad bellum criteria are found, albeit grouped in a different order than in the Summa Theologica, in paragraphs 56 and 57 of the Metaphysics of Morals. 1. The purpose of war is a more perfect peace. In the words of Kant, conduct war according to the principles that it is still possible to leave the state of nature of states and enter into a legal state. Second, the formal declaration of war must be declared by the competent authority. 3. The war must have a just cause. It is required that the attack on the enemy is due to some fault. And 4. The right intention by those who make war. For Kant, this precept refers to a formal prohibition of punitive wars and wars of extermination, which may lead the prince to go to war for impure reasons. In Aquinas, as much as in Kant, the other three criteria, classical criteria of just war theory, of the usual catalog of jus ad bellum, are missing. They had been added in between the two authors, in between Aquinas and Kant, by Vittoria and Suarez. Namely, war must be the last resort to resolve a dispute. 2, there must be a reasonable prospect of success before declaring war. And 3, there must be some proportionality in the relation of misconduct and punishment. So I will now go through all 7 jus ad bellum criteria, thus including the 3 Kant did not include, and try to apply them to cyberwar. The catalog is cumulative, which means that all adopted criteria must be met if a given cyber war is to be considered as a just war. Jus ad bellum. Here we have first a very important criteria, which is the ultimate aim of war is a more perfect peace than before the war. The first criterion is difficult to fulfill simply because cyber wars tend not to stop. That is, to continue almost endlessly, interspersed with more or less long intermissions, possibly at the sub-rosa level, which I mentioned before. However, a war can be just only if there is an end to it, and if the plans for the post-war order correct some deficiencies properly identified prior to the conflict. This means that such a cyber war can only be a response to a kinetic aggression, physical aggression, or a cyber assault from another state, and only in the case when it is designed to eradicate the harmful potential of the opponent. Second criteria, the authority of the prince, the declaration of war. Here we are faced with 2 challenges, time and attribution. Due to the high speed of cyber war flows, the formal diplomatic declaration of war must be reduced to the minimum. That is, to a computer signal sent a few moments before replying to the aggression, by analogy with a warning shot by an individual in an emergency situation. On the other hand, the problem of attribution lies in the fact that in cyberspace it is highly problematic to identify with certainty the attacker, particularly because of the possible presence of other actors in the virtual battlefield, and also because of the likely use of so-called botnets, third-party servers, as it was the case during the attack against Estonia in 2007, with the diversion of at least 1 million computers, personal computers. That is so-called patriotic Russian hackers under the supervision of the Russian army, but it was not the Russian army. It was private actors, but working under the supervision of the Russian army, attacked Estonia and brought down all the internet infrastructure in 2007 for 3 weeks. And they used 1 million personal computer, probably some of your computer, my computer, we don't know. Because they put the virus on your computer, you don't know about it, and then your computer attacks Estonia. So this is what they call a botnet. So then your computer becomes a botnet, right? So it's very difficult then to trace back where the attack comes from originally, right? So this is the problem of attribution. We don't know to identify the enemy. It's very difficult to identify the enemy. So while absolute certainty is never possible in cyberspace, we can, however, morally, I believe, require a very high probability of, say, 99%. In other words, a probabilistic approach here should prevail. This criterion automatically excludes hackers and private contractors which are not submitted to a state authority, for instance by subcontracting, like the Russian patriotic hackers in 2007. The wannabe states such as Puntland or Abkhazia, the cyber guerrillas, as well as terrorist groups, unless they are protected by a state which has knowledge of their actions and does not intervene and stop these actions. Next criteria, just cause. Beyond self-defense against an armed attack, armed attack, an ethical principle which is legally enshrined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which applies a fortiori in case of an attack by a real-world object, assuming a first response by cyber weapons against, for example, the occupation of part of the national territory. Two other ethically acceptable scenarios seem to me possible. A humanitarian intervention, that is a humanitarian cyber intervention, for instance, Syria, why not? To be duly authorized by the UN Security Council, and a preemptive strike in case of a very serious threat from abroad, which potentially endangers the survival of the country. In the not too far future, the analogy is with Michael Walzer's concept of supreme emergency, applied to the Israeli-Arab war, which started on June 5, 1967, by a preemptive strike. Next criteria is right intention. One has to admit that this problem cannot be addressed correctly from a philosophical perspective, because especially in cyberspace, any given actor can easily disguise his evil intention, partly because some actions are not immediately visible to everyone. As a result, we must insist on the greatest possible transparency and remain attentive to the testimony of outside observers, such as, for instance, NGO watchdogs, non-governmental organizations, or neutral states. The proportionality of fault and punishment, very classical thing, very classical criteria of jus ad bellum. Kant dismissed this criteria because he wrote his piece at the beginning of the era of mass warfare through the introduction of general conscription. He wrote after the French Revolution, just after. And then, as you know, after the French Revolution was introduced, the conscription, that is, now the whole male population was engaged in war, which was a total new thing at that time. Came out was the concept of citoyen soldat. Citizen, you enjoy rights, but you have also duties. As a soldier, you have to defend these rights, right? However, since cyberwar is exactly the opposite of mass warfare, I think the criteria should be kept here. So here I take my distance with Kant. It is actually the question of the threshold at which cyber response may start. Obviously, a simple DDoS attack, as against Estonia, of the government website of Bahia, is not enough. It is necessary that the cyber aggression causes human victims through the Internet of Things, which I mentioned before. For example, from nuclear radiation or harmful emissions of chemical plants, or through malfunctions in hospitals, or that it targets vital key interests of the state, distribution of electricity and water, stock markets and financial systems, conventional nuclear defense, social security systems, aviation systems, etc. In order to reach higher precision, which is not within the scope of my lecture today, it is very helpful to use the so-called Schmidt analysis in international law, which gives a qualitative 1 to 10 scale applied to 7 criteria. I will not go into this now. The great advantage of cyber weapons lies in the precision with which the counterattack can be designed at different levels and in various fields. It's the opposite of mass warfare. Furthermore, since a pure cyber war, without the involvement of other national armed forces, naval forces, terrestrial forces, etc., is rather unlikely, above a certain level of aggression, the counterattack can also be made using the multiplier effect from a close coordination between the cyber army and the land, air, and naval forces. In other words, a gradual build-up of war intensity is quite feasible through the phasing of the cyber attack with more traditional means of war. War as a last resort. Immanuel Kant did not adopt this traditional jus ad bellum criteria, probably because he found it hypocrite. In cyber war, it doesn't make sense neither. Indeed, after a cyber attack, there is insufficient time for real diplomatic negotiations in due form. The moral minimum is, however, to ensure that the aggression did not happen by accident. For example, by inadvertently spreading a virus that the attacker himself did not notice, that he does not notice himself that he spread the virus. It is therefore necessary to carry out double checks. The first step in this direction was taken in 2011, 2 years ago, with the installation, as in the good old days of the Cold War, of a telephone hotline between Washington and Moscow to rule out any cyber misunderstanding. We're already there, right? Now the last criteria is a reasonable hope of success. This last criteria was also dismissed by Kant, since it requires a considerable capacity of foresight analysis. In cyberwar, the temptation to conduct an asymmetric war, that is to say a low-level and low-frequency harassment, remains strong for weak states vis-à-vis one of the few cyberpowers. Here we can find a compromise between Kant and the late just war theorists. Even if all other 6 criteria of the jus ad bellum are met, it requires the abandonment of any response if there is a high risk of failure, or of an even stronger counter-response with negative effects for the civilian population, or if it may contribute to an escalating involving superior kinetic forces of the enemy. Thus, even in cyberspace, a minimum symmetry of forces is required. Therefore, even if cyber attacks, by China, a state like Vietnam has no interest whatsoever to reply. The same applies for the time being to, say, Saudi Arabia against Israel. This is the precautionary principle, morally speaking. In these cases, it rather seems morally required to bring the case before international organizations such as the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly, and or to ask for assistance or protection by another cyberpower. I now move to the second dimension, which is shorter, jus in bello. That is, once all criteria of jus ad bellum are met, and the state is ready and morally acceptable to wage war, then the state can still not do whatever it wants during the war, during the period of war, and that is the jus in bello. So in the metaphysics of morals, Immanuel Kant seems to go back to Aquinas, that is to the days before Francisco de Vitoria, to formulate the jus in bello. First, he develops in paragraph 57 the Thomistic notion of permissive and non-permissive tricks. Spies, ambush, assassins, poisoners, snipers, and rumors are explicitly classified as illegal means because they destroy the trust necessary for the development of a future, possibly perpetual peace. Second, there is a weak criteria of proportionality in the jus in bello that states, just as in Aquinas, that looting is prohibited. However, the major issue in this parallel between Kant and Aquinas lies in the missing element of the jus in bello. That is, the discrimination between combatants and non-combatants, between soldiers and civil population, as well as the concomitant notion of collateral damage. Kant makes no mention of this criterion introduced by Vitoria, which underpins the assumption that he adopts a more traditional doctrine. The absence of the criterion of discrimination between combatants and non-combatants and the collateral damage clearly tells us that Kant had detected something in this concept which he deems inappropriate. Francisco de Vitoria introduced the new criterion in De Indis. I quote Vitoria, by accident, it is sometimes permissible to kill innocent people, even voluntarily, for example, when you justly attack a fortress or city in which we know there are many innocent people. Unquote. The reason for the introduction lies in the technical change that occurred in the art of war between Aquinas and Vitoria. Because it goes further, I quote, and when you can use war machines sending projectiles or burn buildings without also hitting the innocent along with the guilty, unquote. He refers, as I mentioned before, to the massive introduction of artillery on the battlefields of Asia Minor in the 14th and 15th century, particularly during the fall of Constantinople in 1453 by Mohammed II. This new technology, artillery, added a new dimension to weapon systems, since it requires the distancing of the hostile combatants, they don't see each other anymore, and the absolute anonymity of the opponent, and since it has the inevitable effect of possibly reaching a large number of innocent non-combatants, innocent civil populations. Hence, the need felt by Vitoria to clearly distinguish between combatants, soldiers, and civil populations, while allowing to kill civil populations by accident only. That's collateral damage. In the doctrine of law, Kant makes no mention of this important criterion. My hypothesis is that he does not see the relevance of making such a discrimination, because of a discontinuity in the art of war which he himself witnessed. Indeed, Immanuel Kant has been contemporary to the massification of war. He observes that revolutionary France, as well as in Prussia in the late 18th century, the general mobilization of the population for military purposes has been established. Thus, the philosopher of Königsberg understands that the nature of warfare has changed. It now embraces the entire social sphere. He draws, this is my hypothesis, an important conclusion. While keeping the criterion of discrimination between combatants and non-combatants of the use of bellum, the entire society is now involved in one way or the other in the war effort. It seems that his science on this traditionally significant criterion, and therefore his return to the Thomistic doctrine, can be interpreted as if Kant wanted to cancel the discrimination between soldiers and civil populations. Mass warfare makes such a differentiation impractical. Let's now go one by one through the three mentioned criteria. The authorization of tricks. This is about deceiving the enemy by false appearances. It is already mentioned by Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. One could imagine that in order to deter its enemy, a state makes in a counterattack somehow believe that it has far-reaching cybernetic abilities, which is not true. Such behavior seems morally permissible as much as cyber propaganda in times of cyber warfare, for example, by diverting media aggressor websites for spreading false information or even cyber espionage. The proportionality of means. In this context, an approach by successive levels is needed. It is important to first define them in a coherent doctrine. For instance, a cyber attack that causes hundreds of deaths by dysfunctioning the civil aviation systems should, of course, cause a less severe response than several nuclear explosions with important radiation effects on a large scale, requiring the evacuation of part of the territory for many years. This criterion is therefore in its structure almost utilitarian. A true calculation of consequences is essential. The last criteria, discrimination between combatants and non-combatants, between soldiers and civil population. It is even more difficult to operate this distinction in cyberspace than in the conventional battlefield. Fortunately, Vitoria gave us the mentioned casuistic concept par excellence, the collateral damage, which is allowed if it's not directly intentioned. This means that the cyber force general, who supervises a response and perfectly knows that it will also affect civilian populations, is morally clean if his action is first and foremost aimed at a military target, such as adverse computer servers or conventional military facilities. For example, the communication systems between adverse army units. This means that only weaponry, cyber or kinetic, capable of discrimination directed against legitimate targets can be used. However, cyber strategists should know that legitimate targets can include civilian objects, especially those having cyber aspects, that have dual military and civilian use. The ethics of just war requires both. The targeteers do everything possible to ensure that the target is a proper military objective. in practice, it seems, for the time being, and things evolve very, very quickly. For the time being, it's technically not possible. Thus, the Kantian reservation vis-à-vis the concept of collateral damage is, for the time being, in my view, perfectly acceptable. Third and last dimension, the use post bellum. That's a new thing Kant introduced to the philosophy of war. Just war ethics does not need to determine if the ethical norms should be implemented by codified legal norms or by the development of existing provisions of the law of armed conflict, as long as they can be implemented correctly. Therefore, any new legal agreements are, ethically speaking, not compulsory. The vast literature over the last years has shown that jus ad bellum and jus in bello norms can be applied to the law, the existing law of armed conflict, by drawing legal analogies from the UN Charter and from existing customary law. However, it seems to be necessary to amend the traditional just war theory, which is limited to jus in bello and jus ad bellum, by adding the Kantian jus post bellum. And then I will try to demonstrate that the ethical jus post bellum norms must be implemented through a new international treaty. As far as I know, nobody has yet attempted to adapt the Kantian jus post bellum to cyberwar. Most authors using the just war theory either do it in law, in international law, and entirely ignore the Kantian jus post bellum. The very few authors who deal with it, like Di Meglio or Arendt, actually get mixed up with two jus ad bellum provisions, which they mistakenly take for jus post bellum norms. They are exclusively concerned by the way war is terminated and how the transition from war to peace is to be organized. Some even write mistakenly that, I quote Di Meglio, although he recognized Kant the need to identify and discuss jus post bellum, Kant did not specify criteria for the category. That's unquote. I think it's wrong. Kant was not concerned with the war termination or the transition from war to peace, except as prospective jus ad bellum provisions. Otherwise, it was not his problem as a philosopher. His concern was rather on a more abstract level about the consequences of a particular war act for all or almost all countries of the world of his time. And here we can draw two criteria. Firstly, Kant is very much concerned by, I quote the metaphysics of morals, the violation of public agreements, international public agreements, which presumably are of interest to all peoples since their freedom is threatened, unquote. Applied to cyberspace, this disposition can be interpreted in the following way. The bombing and decommissioning of all 13 or 11, I don't remember, root servers, which I mentioned earlier, on which the entire internet relies, meaning the implosion of the entire internet for at least some time, constitutes a breach of the agreement that connects all nations of the world to ICANN. ICANN is a private organization in California which holds the register of the internet. It's a Californian firm, actually. The whole internet relies on this Californian-based private firm. ICANN is running the root servers of the world. And they have agreements with all the countries when you have dots, .fr, etc. Also, ICANN is formally a private firm in California. Its role is to ensure the free movement of data through the constant and real-time update of the single global registry of domain names. The implosion of the internet, including the web and email, even only for a few days, would cause such economic and social damage that it seems justified to be morally bad. Secondly, Kant provides us with another jus post bellum norm. An unjust enemy is, I quote, one whose publicly expressed will reflects a maxim according to which, if it were a universal rule, no peace is possible between peoples, while on the contrary, the state of nature becomes eternal, unquote. That's paragraph 60 of the Doctrine of Law. Here we recognize easily one form of the categorical imperative. Such a return to the political state of nature seems possible in one case scenario. A malware, a malicious software, which destroys in a very short time and permanently all or most artifacts connected to cyberspace. Computers, mobile phones, tablets, servers, satellite systems, GPS, television, digital radio, etc., with unimaginable consequences for the global economy, the relations between states, and the internal cohesion of societies. For sure, in Malawi or Kiribati, the consequences would be relatively minor, but most developed states would experience shocks on an unprecedented scale, so that at least for a while no stable peace would be possible, and a return to a sort of state of nature would appear, political state of nature would appear as inevitable. Our societies have become just too dependent on cyberspace. The two Kantian jus post bellum criteria of paragraph 60 of the Metaphysics of Morals may raise concern about a sort of virtual Armageddon, in which the existing electromagnetic spectrum is used to destroy many parts of the cyberspace as such, and, above all, many objects linked to the Internet of Things. Despite the fact that both are artifacts, they can nowadays be labeled as global commons. At least the most developed and emerging countries of the world heavily rely on them each single minute now for our infrastructure. The cyberspace and the Internet of Things have actually become the center of gravity for the globalized world. By analogy with the biosphere, one may call it the infosphere. And its almost total informational entropy can morally be considered to be the ultimate evil in cyber conflict. It is the common duty of all nations to prevent and to outlaw any actor who may try to interrupt the peaceful flow of data in the international system and to bring the world back to a pre-cyber age. Especially the vulnerable developed countries should fear such a debilitation equally. Unfortunately, it cannot be totally ruled out that a, say, rogue state such as North Korea launches one day an attack against the entire cyberspace and or the Internet of Things. In addition, there's, for instance, I just got one example there. Now, the pacemakers are linked by Wi-Fi, and so there has been already one case where a pacemaker has been controlled by a hacker, and the guy died. You can, of course, control all the pacemakers, which now emit some signals. So this is one example of the Internet of Things. Right? So, in addition, transnational actors such as jihadist groups may acquire sufficient technical competence to destroy at least part of the Internet and the Internet of Things. We don't know what will be technically possible in, say, 10 years from now. Therefore, because things evolve extremely quickly, therefore it seems of utmost ethical importance to demonstrate a common, universal, or almost universal consensus on these issues. Experts of international law should be mandated, if possible by the UN Security Council or the General Assembly, to find law provisions which clearly outlaw any attempt to destroy the cyberspace and the Internet of Things. Possibly they could qualify it even as a crime against humanity because it targets one of the global commons as such. Any international treaty may be fostered against the will of the United States of America, which are reluctant, because America has by far, by very, very far, the most advanced cyberwar capability, and any new agreement or norm would likely oblige the United States of America to accept deep constraints on its use of cyber weapons and techniques. Some short conclusions. In the foregoing, it has been attempted to superficially clear the ground. All the different just war criteria deserve considerably deeper discussion. It was important to clarify several provisions, especially of the jus ad bellum, as some of them are frequently mixed up with the Kantian jus post bellum. The main conclusions are, first, the Kantian jus post-bellum has by far not attracted enough attention as far as cyberwar is concerned. Second, while the Kantian jus ad bellum and jus in bello can be implemented by adopting and developing the existing UN Charter and customary law, this seems not to be possible for the jus post bellum. Here an international treaty is needed for the simple reason that any other legal solution may only arrive when it is already much too late. It is morally required to implement as soon as possible, I think, a universal treaty banning once for all any attempt to destroy entire parts of the cyberspace and of the Internet of Things. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. We're going to have the response by Professor Marcelo de Araujo.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I would like to thank you, my colleague and friend Nythamar, for this kind invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Porto Alegre again within such a short time. And this time it's not only a pleasure, it's also a great honor for me to be in a position to make some comments on the opening lecture of the evening. But perhaps there is less disagreement between the position I would like to defend here, between myself and Professor Giesen, than it might appear at first glance, but there are some points of disagreement which of course are subject to discussion. I have written a short text which I would like to read. So, cyber war and cyber attack are terms that have become part of our political vocabulary. We use them to express our obsession with security and the external threat in the age of information technology. Professor Giesen has advanced an in-depth philosophical account of cyber war as a distinctly new form of warfare. Cyber war is fought within the domain of cyberspace by means of cyber weapons, which are then used to launch cyber attacks on enemies and would-be enemies. One important philosophical question, which both moral and political philosophers are expected to address here, is the question relative to the circumstances of justice in the cyberspace. Which forms of a cyber aggression may be accepted as legitimate in the context of a cyber war, and which forms of a cyber aggression shall be rejected and condemned as instances of cyber war crimes? These are, indeed, pressing questions. NATO, for instance, has already cooperative cyber defense centre of excellence established in Estonia and aftermath of a series of cyber attacks which nearly brought this country to a halt in 2007. Fortunately, we do not have to concern ourselves here with the technical, political and strategic questions with which NATO has to deal. A question is rather of a philosophical nature, namely, can traditional just war theories be deployed in our understanding of the moral limits of cyber war, or does cyber war require a brand new just war theory? Professor Giesen proposed an original attempt to employ Kant's theory of justice in his own account of the moral limits of cyber war. I would like to put forth here two interconnected questions related to Professor Giesen's approach. The first question concerns the limits of Kant's theory in the face of modern warfare. The second question concerns the very idea of a cyber war. My point is that Kant's theory of justice may, indeed, provide us with some general guidelines in the context of a discussion on the moral limits of a war at large, including cyber war. Kant may have witnessed, but the application of his theory may also, on the other hand, prevent us from comprehending the distinctive nature of modern international conflicts. Kant may have witnessed major wars, but the idea of a total war was, it seems to me, alien to him. Kant certainly saw that states might be devastated in the course of a war, but he could not possibly have thought of a state of affairs in which mankind as such would be annihilated as the result of a war. This, I regret to let you know, is the state of affairs in which we live now. The kind of threat posed by cyberwar is not new. In the wake of the first successful tests with thermonuclear bombs conducted by the United States and the former Soviet Union, Hans Morgenthau called attention to the contrast between the technological progress of our age and the limits of our moral commitments as one of the most disturbing dilemmas of our time. Writing in 1962, 50 years ago, he affirms the following, I quote, "The first dilemma consists in the contrast between the technological unification of the world and the parochial moral commitments and political institutions of the age. Moral commitments and political institutions dating from an age which modern technology has left behind has not kept pace with technological achievements and, hence, are incapable of controlling the destructive potentialities." End quote. Morgenthau's basic point here is that our moral commitments, and I assume he also means the traditional moral theories which have given support to our moral commitments, have not been able to adapt themselves to the circumstances of modern international politics. Nuclear weapons of mass destruction have radically changed the geopolitics of the 20th century. For decades, these weapons had been under the strict control of a few states. But over the years, the technology for the development of nuclear weapons has also gradually leaked to other states and even to private persons eager to sell this technology to weaker states or terrorist groups. Moreover, unstable states such as, for instance, Pakistan or North Korea, which do already have nuclear weapons, may disintegrate in the future as a result of an internal turmoil, and it's uncertain whether a part of the nuclear arsenal might not fall in the hands of terrorist groups. The danger of terrorism and nuclear conflict, therefore, is likely to increase, not to decrease in the future. The emergence of cyberwar now makes the scenario far more frightening and complex than Morgenthau could possibly have foreseen 50 years ago. This problem is especially complex and frightening because it's not even clear whether or to which extent cyberwar may be comprehended as an authentic form of war, capable of being compromised by principles of justice. Of course, we can use the word war in a broad sense, as when we speak of the war on corruption or the war on drugs. The word war is clearly being used in a metaphorical sense in these cases. It seems to me that most frequently, when people speak about cyber war nowadays, the word war is being used in this rather broader sense. One distinctive feature of a war, comprehended in a narrower sense, is that it is public. The public character of a war, in its narrower sense, becomes clear, for instance, when we see soldiers and officers wearing uniforms in the front line. The use of uniforms by cyber soldiers fighting within the cyberspace would be a waste of time, for one of the main features of a cyber war is the very fact that the operations are not public. As far as I am concerned, there has never been, in the history of mankind, a war where the main actors did not know each other, a war in which one state did not know which was the other state against which a war was being waged. Two of the most debated cases of cyber war in our own time can be referred to as a war only in this broader sense of the word war. The first case is the American operation to dismantle Iran's nuclear program in 2010, And the other case is the attack against the Estonia's computer network in 2007. Both cases should be primarily described in terms of the sabotage and espionage rather than authentic operations of war. As far as the first case is concerned, the operation only became public because the computer worm known as Stuxnet, used to damage the centrifuges of Iran, got loose on the internet and spread across the globe. Its function was eventually disclosed by a team of specialists around the world, and the affair then became public. The Russian government, on the other hand, to this day denies its involvement in the attack against the Estonian computer network. Thus, the attempt to articulate a theory of justice to fit cyberwar, at least in these cases, may be as misleading as the attempt to articulate a theory of justice to regulate acts of espionage and sabotage. During the Cold War, espionage and sabotage loomed large, but as far as I know, no one came out with the brilliant idea of proposing a philosophical just war theory in order to fit the constraints of a Cold War. Questions of justice were simply dismissed as out of place when the goals of security and survival were at stake. Now, it's important to see that the states and the individuals acting on behalf of the states usually act as they do in the context of international relations, not on the grounds of their unwillingness to abide by principles of justice, but because the structure of international relations compels them to this kind of behavior. And one of the distinguishing features of the system of states is its anarchical structure. This is the lack of a central government analogous to the central government which exists in the context of domestic politics. It means that each individual state is the man responsible for its own integrity and survival. In the absence of a superior authority over and above the power of each sovereign state, political leaders and diplomats feel compelled to favor security over morality, even if, all other things being considered, they would be more inclined to trust and to cooperate with political leaders of other states. Consider, for instance, the incident with the Norwegian weather rocket in 1995. Russian radars detected a missile which was then suspected of being on its way to reach Moscow in 5 minutes. All levels of Russian military defense were immediately put on alert for a possible imminent attack and massive retaliation. It was reported that for the first time in history, a Russian president had before him, ready to be used, the nuclear briefcase from which the permission to launch nuclear weapons is used. In the event, it was realized that the rocket was leaving Russian territory, and Boris Yeltsin did not have to enter history books as the man who started the Third World War by mistake. But under the crushing pressure of having to decide in such a short time and on the basis of unreliable information whether or not to retaliate, even a well-intentioned Boris Yeltsin, willing to abide by principles of justice, might have given orders to launch a devastating nuclear response, and that in spite of the strong moral dispositions to the contrary. Our greatest challenge nowadays, therefore, is not so much that of thinking of principles of justice to fit the age of the internet and cyber attacks. Our greatest challenge is to think of an alternative to the structure of a system of states in which we currently live and which constrains us to resurrect old just war theories in the first place. Once you have understood how the structure of the system of states often constrains actors operating within this structure to prefer war over peace, as well as conflict over cooperation and mistrust over trust, in situations in which everyone would be better off by acting otherwise, we can also ask ourselves whether, Given the goals of security and survival in a world in which weapons of mass destruction and information technology are become so readily available, we would not have reasons to radically change this structure, or perhaps even to get rid of it. The idea I'm proposing here is that the system of states should gradually give place to a world state, a world government. My intention now is not to propose a blueprint for the implementation of this radical change in the structure of international politics, but simply to explain why this option is not incompatible with the realist approach I endorse here. The idea of a world state, devoid of state borders and ruled by a supranational institution, was perfectly in line with the original project of some realists like Hans Morgenthau, though it eventually disappeared in the works of the so-called neo-realists like John Mearsheimer. The suggestion that the system of states could one day be abolished might perhaps be objected as an absurd idea, and indeed as wholly incompatible with the political realism itself. This objection is correct to the extent that political realism presupposes the very existence of the system of states. Should the system of states ever disappear, political realism itself would certainly fail to make any sense. It's not entirely clear, however, whether political realism must necessarily be comprehended as a theory both descriptive and prescriptive. Although some realists do advocate political realism on both descriptive and prescriptive grounds, it seems to me that we can coherently retain only the descriptive aspect of the theory. Consider the following passage from Mearsheimer's The Strategy of Great Power Politics. I quote, "It should be apparent from this discussion that offensive realism is mainly a descriptive theory. It explains how great powers have behaved in the past and how they are likely to behave in the future. But it is also a prescriptive theory. States should behave according to the dictates of offensive realism because it outlines the best way to survive in a dangerous world." End quote. Political realism describes the structure of the international relations in a world devoid of central government. The absence of an instance with the power to enforce laws for mutual benefit on a global scale means that states can only count on self-help in the attempt to guarantee their own survival. This is, as Mearsheimer suggests, a dangerous world. But if the survival of mankind in the future becomes threatened in virtue of a nuclear war or cyberwar, or perhaps both, then abolishing the system of states rather than following the dictates of Mearsheimer's offensive realism may very well be the best prescription to follow in order to ensure our security and survival in this new dangerous world. It's interesting to note that, unlike neo-realists, early supporters of realism, such as, for instance, Morgenthau, did not always defend their own position, their own theories on normative grounds. As early as 1962, Morgenthau understood that the greatest threat to the survival of mankind consisted in the contrast between our technological capability for mutual destruction on the one hand, and the poor moral commitments and political institutions of the present age on the other hand. Our capacity for mutual destruction has been now enhanced by the possibility of a cyber war. But Morgenthau's proposed solution to the survival of the mankind did not involve the attempt to resurrect the just war theory of a long-dead German philosopher, but rather in subverting the system of states which has constrained us to articulate just war theories in the first place. Morgenthau realized that if the primary function of the state is to ensure the security and survival of its own citizens, then the state conceived as a means to an end, had become obsolete by the time both the United States and the former Soviet Union had concluded their first thermonuclear tests. As Morgenthau put the problem in 1966, there is really no point in trying to protect oneself in the event of a major nuclear war, for all one can hope to avoid is such a war in the first place. The same applies now in the case of a grand-scale cyber war. Our obsession with security and survival can only be satisfied, Morgenthau assumed, by creating a world state operating within the framework of a supranational political order. I quote, "Modern technology has rendered our nation-state obsolete as a principle of political organization, for the nation-state is no longer able to perform what's